is Gary Trosclair. I am a psychotherapist and a Jungian psychoanalyst, and I'm happy to introduce my book today to everyone, The Healthy Compulsive, Healing Obsessive-Compulsive Personality Disorder and Taking the Wheel of the Driven Personality. Yes, that's quite a mouthful, and there is a reason for that. The personality style that I'm describing in this book is very hard to describe. We really don't have words for it. It's something that's often misunderstood, it's misdiagnosed, and I think worst of all, it's often misused by the very people who have this personality style. People who have this personality style, which I prefer to call driven, can be in the worst end of the spectrum. They can be very rigid, they can be controlling, they can be workaholic, they can be very bossy. But on the more adaptive end, or the healthy end of the spectrum, they can be very productive, they can be conscientious, they can be very reliable and loyal. So there's the whole spectrum here of this personality, which is often called compulsive, but which I prefer to call driven. People will often refer to something like this as a type A personality. In clinical literature, it's referred to obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, the acronym for which is OCPD. And that's not to be confused with OCD, which is obsessive-compulsive disorder. These are very different diagnoses, and unfortunately, people are often misdiagnosed with OCD when they really have OCPD, and the treatment is usually quite different. There's some overlap between the two, but unfortunately, people often hear OCD and they think, oh, that sounds a little bit like me, and so they think they're OCD when they may not really be. Very different. So the book is in 4 parts. The first part of it describes the driven personality. It also talks about the clinical name OCPD and distinguishes it from OCD. It also talks about how we come to be this way. There's a very strong genetic component to it. Many of these characteristics, such as perfectionism, have a big inherited component to it. But of course, it's also shaped to some degree by our environment, our parents and the culture that we grew up in, particularly our culture, which tends to be very compulsive. We don't even recognize it often. In fact, there's research that says that OCPD is, well, it's one of the most frequently occurring personality disorders in our culture. It's often not recognized or diagnosed properly. People don't even recognize it for the most part. So that's the first part of the book, where I identify it, talk about how it got to be that way. In the second part of the book, I talk about how to realize the potential of the driven personality. And I do this in 4 steps. One has to do with understanding the underlying story that we tell ourselves about that, the narrative, which might or might not be true. And if we need to, we might need to alter that story about how the best way to get along in the world is. The second step has to do with engaging deeper levels of emotion. There are often many layers of emotion. People who are compulsive are often aware of the level of anger or frustration, sometimes of anxiety, but often not aware of the deeper fears beneath that. In fact, what happens sometimes is that people who are born with a compulsive style, they tend to be very energetic and perfectionistic and passionate. But if they don't feel very secure in their environment, they might enlist those capabilities in order to prove themselves. And that's what often leads people to become very rigid and actually very desperate about needing to get things done a very certain way. The third part of the second part of the book, the third chapter, has to do with cultivating meaning. To understand what those deeper urges, what we call compulsions, there really urges deep inside us to be able to do something that's meaningful. And we need to go back and understand, what is the purpose behind all this energy? Where does it really want to go? Not so much looking back to the past as what went wrong, but where is it I really want to go with my energy and with my drive? And then the fourth part of that chapter on realizing the potential of the driven personality is about taking action, specific things that you need to do in order to become a healthy compulsive. In the third part of the book, I talk about fulcrum issues. These are places that we run into in our lives that we're most vulnerable as people who have compulsive style, but also there's a lot of potential. First section of that part has to do with the body. People who are compulsive or driven often neglect their body, and it raises a lot of problems. It keeps us from getting where we really want to go if we don't take care of the body. There's a chapter in this section on relationships, partnering, and parenting, because an unhealthy compulsive style can ruin relationships. They ruin families all the time. Most of the correspondence I get is from partners of people who are in relationships with people who have very unhealthy OCPD. And they're trying to find a way to deal with it. So this particular chapter helps people who do have OCPD to understand the impact they have on other people and to try to manage it in a healthy way so that it actually helps the partnership or helps the family. Another chapter in this section has to do with time and money. People who are compulsive tend to hold on to things an awful lot. They can be very frugal with money, which can be a good thing, but they can become so tight that they even aren't working in their best interest with it. They forget what money is for in the first place. Very similar is with time. Sometimes we get very urgent, we rush, and we forget, what is time really for? There's a chapter in the book on play, leisure, and relaxing. This can be very hard for people who are compulsive to do. They go on vacations and they're just trying to get it perfect, and it spoils it, at least for them, if not for the whole family. It's a chapter on work and career. For someone who has compulsive personality, it can be very fulfilling to do something that's meaningful and productive and serves a greater purpose. But there's also the potential that they'll become workaholic. And they work so much that they forget what they're working for, and they neglect themselves, and they might neglect their relationships and their family and their friendships. The last section in this part on fulcrum issues is about psychological growth. Psychological growth has become, it's in a way overused. It's the idea of becoming our best self has become almost trite. And I try to rescue what's important about this idea, and also understand that I think what's at the root of the compulsive style for many people is a real urge to become as developed as they can as a person. That energy can be hijacked, or it can be used in an adaptive way. And so there's an entire chapter on understanding the true nature of psychological growth. In the fourth section, I talk about resources for the road ahead for the person who is compulsive. And there's a special chapter for the families and partners of people who have OCPD, people who are on the far end of the unhealthy end of the compulsive spectrum. At the end of each chapter, I give suggestions and exercises for how to really implement these steps in your life. Because to have just the idea is one thing, to read it. It's another thing to actually know how to translate that into your life in a way that really helps you to become adaptive and healthy in the way that you want to become. There are also examples of people going through the process throughout the book. So that's a brief outline of the healthy compulsive. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope it's helpful to you.